Hi there, and welcome to Chapter 2, Harnessing Big Data into Better Decisions. Let's jump in. So today's learning objectives are to first identify data, big data, information, and intelligence, and their importance. And we're going to distinguish the difference between these different terms here. Next, we're going to list the four characteristics that describe data, and I'm going to explain those for you in detail. And then finally, we're going to recognize what a decision support system is and the tools that help make it work. Let's get started. So, first of all, data is really the key driver for marketing research. And so much so that we say that it's the fuel used to create knowledge, and that knowledge is then used to make decisions for the organization. These decisions can be multi-million, multi-billion dollar decisions for a major corporation. Big data is large quantities of data that have been taken from multiple and varied sources. And the key with big data is that companies and or individuals have to integrate all of these different multiple and varied sources of data to be able to get the data into one place. And that's where the decision support systems come in. The big data can be analyzed, but there are some caveats associated with big data and analysis. One being that it's very difficult to acquire big data, especially if you're trying to get it from very many different places. Even if it's within your own organization, you usually have to bring experts in that understand coding processes and understand how to do basically anything that has to do with computer science. They will be able to help you set up your decision support systems, your data warehouses, and your databases. That's really the key, is that with big data, it's an acquisition process. It's not just something that you can easily do manually, each individual working at this. It would take considerable amount of time and money. And so usually with big data, you have some type of cleaning process that has to occur. And that's because if you're obtaining data from outside the organization, a lot of times that data doesn't come in the format that you want it to be in. So you often have to clean that data, and that's something that we're going to talk more about in Chapter 6. Also, you have to consider the storage and computational power of your different servers and the different computers that you have available to you. So if you think back to the 1960s when computers were first starting to come about, they had rooms and rooms of servers, and even just one computer may take up an entire room, like your living room or your bedroom in your apartment or your house. So we've come a long way where now we have these thin, slim laptops that can do a whole lot more than what computers could 30, 40 years ago, or even I would say 10 years, 5, 10 years ago. Our computers today are leaps and bounds ahead of what could have been done 5 to 10 years ago. And that's why we've seen so much of this artificial intelligence come about and a resurgent in artificial intelligence over the last few years. So today we do have a lot better options for our storage and computational power. And with that, our analysis that we're able to do with all this data that we get, the analysis is what really gives the data meaning. Because if you think about it, you may have all these rows and columns that have different information in them. Say, think about it as a customer's purchasing information. You may have their first name, you may have their last name, you may have how many orders that they placed. But until you get into the data and actually do analysis, you really don't have any type of understanding of what that data means. And so the end process of analyzing this data is to actually make a choice, make a decision. And that's kind of where we're going to go from with the company, your research project that you do. You know, you come up with this company, you have a problem that you see or an opportunity that's faced by the company, and you conduct marketing research to see if that opportunity or problem can be fixed or can be capitalized on. And then at the end of the day, you're really trying to make a choice. Okay, should we pursue this opportunity, or is there another viable way for us to address some type of problem? And so really the whole endpoint is for you to make a strategic choice based off of the data and the information that you collect as a marketing researcher. So that describes data and big data. This slide describes the difference between data, information, and intelligence. Each of these components equal value for the organization. However, as we move up the pyramid towards market intelligence, that represents the most value for the organization. And it represents the smallest amount of the component of the three. We start out with this data, big data. There's so much available to us. If you think about surveys that are done, you could think of interviews, focus groups, but also think about all the transactions that are made on a daily basis for like Market Street or United. They have many different Uniteds, and there's many different customers coming in buying different things. So there's constantly an increasing amount of data coming into Market Street and United. However, from that data, they obtain a much smaller amount of information. And information represents more value for the company because that information, they're deriving insights from that data that they're collecting on a daily basis. And then finally, from that information, they are able to obtain market intelligence, which allows the company to make better decisions, and it's a much smaller subset of the three that we've talked about. So we start out with this big data, we get smaller to information, and then finally we get to even smaller to the market intelligence, which market intelligence, as I've said, represents the most value for the firm. Next, we're going to describe the characteristics of valuable information. And this could be related to data as well, or market intelligence. So all three of those things, whenever we're talking about these characteristics, we have to be mindful that these represent data and market intelligence as well. So the first thing has to do with relevance. And relevance is whenever we're talking about how important a particular data set is. And importance in this regard is how important that data or information is to a firm's strategic decision making. So something that could actually alter a situation if the information changed. So let's think about like dietary trends for Dunkin' Donuts. If consumers' dietary trends change significantly from, say, 5 years ago, then that would be something that Dunkin' Donuts would have to take into account. And they would have to take into account how their competitors have been addressing these changes in dietary trends. One key thing that we have to keep in mind is that whenever we're gathering information and we're acquiring data, it's important that we're not acquiring data that has no relevance to us. So if we're Dunkin' Donuts and we're collecting information on how people's driving habits are changing, that may not be as important to us because if people want Dunkin' Donuts, they're going to find a way to get to our location, whether it's by bus, bicycle, whatever it might be. So driving habits may not be relevant information for us to collect. And whenever we collect irrelevant information, it's a waste of time and money for the organization. And we definitely don't want to be wasting the organization's time or money, or our time. Our time, of course, is very valuable as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is completeness of the data. So with completeness, that means that you have the right amount, and we're talking about how comprehensive the information is. So for instance, if in chapter 1 we talked about how Starbucks, if you watch that video, Starbucks tried to go into Australia, and they really didn't do very well in Australia. And so if we were to be considering the completeness of the information, Starbucks may have done really well in the United States, and they thought that they were going to do really well in Australia the same way that they did in the United States, but they didn't take into account that Australian consumers are very different than American consumers. So they probably didn't have a complete picture of the information that would have been available to them had they conducted the marketing research necessary to get and understand the Australian consumer in comparison to the American consumer. And finally, with completeness, we need to have enough data or information to be able to explain or predict some phenomenon. So we would need to, if we're talking about dietary trends again, we would need to have enough information for a particular demographic or a particular geographic region. That way we could make a some type of generalization to say, okay, for this region, this group of consumers prefers cake donuts versus yeast donuts. But that may not hold true across the entire United States. So we would need to have enough information to be able to predict that across the entire United States or explain that for a more generalizable population. The second characteristic of valuable information is data quality. And what I mean by data quality is thinking about the accuracy of your data. Is the information correct? And information may not be correct if you're obtaining it from a secondary source, or there may have been a mistake whenever the data is uploaded. There's also problems that you could run into whenever you're administering a survey. So there's many different ways that the data quality may not be so accurate, and we're going to get into those in the different chapters that we talk about: surveys, qualitative data, and secondary data. We'll get into that more. Data quality, we have to also think about validity and reliability. And one of the key things is, especially for secondary data, is where was the data obtained? So there are more valid and reliable sources than others, and that's what we have to consider whenever we're deciding whether or not we want to A, collect that information, and B, use that information in our decision-making process. Finally, we can enhance our data quality by inspecting and cleansing the data. So we can look at that data and determine whether or not that the data, if it's reliable, if it's valid, if it's accurate, does it match previous trends, is it way off from previous historical trends, and we may have to manipulate the data a little bit to fit our current needs. Also, by using reputable sources, and then also whenever we're thinking about research participants, that our compensation really matches the tasks or demands that we're asking of them. So for instance, we would not ask someone to do an hour interview with us for $1. We would of course, give them adequate compensation. That way they feel like the information that they're providing is going to be more accurate and more reliable for us. And the last characteristic of valuable information is timeliness. And timeliness refers to how up to date the information is. So we would not want to use data, even now, we wouldn't want to use data from 5 years ago, because is that data going to represent the current population? It may, but it's better if we can collect current data and we can find the most up-to-date data as possible. So a lot of times we, of course, want to look at those historical trends, but it's important to consider the historical trends with current data. So the more current data that we have, the better off we will be as an organization. And then finally, whenever you think about the market today, there is intense competition, especially in the technology sector. I'm sure you're aware that there's always some type of new technology that's coming out on the market. And so whenever we have this great fluctuation or change or turbulence, that requires that we have more timely data because things are constantly changing, and as things constantly change, people's preferences, desires, and wants also change. So that means that we have to get more up-to-date data, and that's where if we're a company like an e-commerce company or even United Supermarkets, we're getting the most up-to-date data and information as possible because we have people making transactions on a daily basis. But us analyzing and reporting that information also has to go into play because we can't wait and sit on that data for months and months and months and not make any decisions based off of the current information that we have. So it's important that we use the most up-to-date data that we have available to us. Finally, one of the last things that I'm going to talk about are decision support systems. And what I want you to understand about decision support systems is we have, even in the most basic format, 4 different types. And you can think of our most basic as being spreadsheets. So a spreadsheet is going to allow you to make decisions because you can do a lot more than what you would be able to do by hand. With Excel spreadsheets, you can create tables, you can make graphs, you can do analyses through Excel, and you can automate things within Excel. So that is more of a flat aspect of a decision support system. You can have multiple spreadsheets, you can have multiple text files, and those represent a type of decision support system, but it requires a lot of intervention by you, the user of the spreadsheet. Now with relational databases, that's where it becomes a little bit more complex, where you have different spreadsheets that are basically talking to each other. And there's a great video that describes a little bit more about relational databases in the video lectures, and I encourage you to watch that. With expert systems, we become even more complex, and if you think about expert systems, think about it like this, where it's more of the GPS context, and your GPS is able to provide you an up-to-date route. Say, for instance, if there's construction up in the route that you've already been provided, they can say, would you like to reroute? I'm sure you've experienced that where you've been offered the option, would you like to reroute, yes or no? And so an expert system can offer you a decision that you can make, and sometimes expert systems can also initiate decisions and processes for you. So in the background of Google Maps and any Maps type application, there's a lot of things going on under the hood that we generally don't even think about because it's just natural for us to pull up our GPS and use it as a tool. But there are things going on under the hood, and that rely on expert systems. Now, artificial intelligence is a little bit more advanced than expert systems. However, in the past, scholars and industry people have used expert systems and artificial intelligence to be synonymous. Artificial intelligence is a little bit more beyond what expert systems are, and the reason for that is because with artificial intelligence now, you can have a system that makes decisions for you. So you think of, let's say, like the Tesla, the autonomous driving function, that it can actually make decisions without any user intervention, and they've been testing that and trying to get that to where a user doesn't even have to make any driving decisions, that the car will do all the driving for them. And so that represents a more advanced form of artificial intelligence. With decision support systems in business, this allows for us to have more informed decision making. Of course, you can see that at the most basic level with spreadsheets. If you have data that if you were doing all the data calculations by hand, it would take you a long time, and you wouldn't be able to really get very far because with spreadsheets, you can actually see relationships between variables. You can actually make visual images of the data, and you can have a better understanding of what the data represents, and that gets us to that more informed level of market intelligence. It also allows us to have more timely problem solving. So again, if you were to do it by hand, it would take a long time, but with spreadsheets and some of these other decision support systems, we're able to have more timely problem solving. And then finally, it improves our efficiency. And that would be efficiency in decision making and efficiency overall for us to get our job done. Because again, doing all these things by hand would take a very long time for us to do. So the last thing that I wanted you to look at and make sure you're aware of, if you haven't seen this picture in the book, I think it's a really great visual for us to understand the different sources of marketing inputs for decision support systems. So on the left here, if you look at the sources of the marketing input, we have internal records, proprietary marketing research, which are our surveys, our interviews. We could also have our salesperson input. So most organizations have salespeople because they're having to go out and sell the product or the service. And then our behavioral tracking, which we'll get into a little bit more through observation, web tracking as well, and then our outside vendors and external distributors. And our outside vendors and external distributors, we of course, especially if we're having a company that's a retail outlet, we need to be able to interface with our service providers. That way we can make sure that we have enough product on hand. And if we actually have created a product, we need to be able to know where our product is at any given time and be able to anticipate certain demand and supply issues that could come into play. That is it for the lesson on Chapter 2. Next time we will cover Chapter 3. Make sure that you watch the additional videos that I've included in the videos lectures folder for Module 2. They're definitely a big help and will explain some things additionally better than the book does and give you a lot more detail than what's available in your book. So please watch that, and I'll look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.